Humankind has always had a fascination with being the first to discover a new continent, the first to fly solo around the world, or the first to have the new iPhone. The space race was this obsession with being first played out on the world stage.
Some general overview of the space race. So the space race kind of started because of the Cold Wars. Following World War II, the US and Russia kind of entered into a Cold War, not as well known, not a war on a battlefield, but more of between ideologies, socialism and democracy. Um, and at first they were kind of working to see who could build nuclear warheads fastest, and then eventually this kind of turned into a race to get to space. In 1957, Soviets really started this by launching Sputnik, which was the first man-made object um, to enter orbit. And then the US not wanting to be far behind, it's kind of what the whole Cold War was about, was trying to one up each other. They launched Explorer 1 and created NASA, um, which is a federal agency dedicated to space. And then not long after, the Soviets already had a man in orbit, orbit Earth in 1961, which was pretty impressive. So they were the first to have a man-made object in space, and then the first to have a man orbit Earth. But the US was really focused on making a push to get someone to land on the moon, and they called this the Apollo mission. In 1967, they had a failure, and 3 astronauts died in a failed launch. They stuck with it and were determined to be the first ones on the moon, and beat Russia to a lunar landing. And so the Apollo mission was successful in 1969, when 3 Americans landed on the moon. And as you can see in the picture, everyone's iconic picture, planted a American flag on the moon. And this was a huge accomplishment for the United States kind of in the space race. It essentially kind of ended the space race. The Russians had some failed lunar attempts in the years following, but the United States really solidified itself by landing first on the moon. While this ended the space race, the Cold War definitely continued on for years to come.
My name is David Joint, and I'm going to be talking about the cultural effects that the space race had on the US, starting with education. So before the launch of the Sputnik satellite, there wasn't much effort that was put into the education system in the US, but once we entered the space race, the government realized it needed young minds to succeed. So the National Science Foundation put $500 million toward teacher and science research, and curriculum taught in schools changed, and more of an emphasis was put on the sciences. And undergraduates at college universities were funded to do research in order to give the U.S. an edge in the race. And Congress also passed the National Defense Education Act in 1957, and this introduced media into the classroom, and teaching tools like videotapes and audio recordings began to be used. It also put over $1 billion into science education and brought early versions of the technology that we have in classes today, like projectors and lab kits. And ultimately, the space race kind of reformed our education system into what we're familiar with today, and put an emphasis on the importance of education that we as Americans are kind of accustomed to in our culture now. And moving on to the cultural effects that it had on values of Americans. So big parts of American culture are the values of determination and competition, and these values were definitely fostered during the space race. So as Americans, we are accustomed to competition with sports and at school and in the workplace. And the space race was just seen as another form of competition, but definitely on a much bigger and larger scale. And after Sputnik, the U.S. was behind the Soviet Union in terms of the space race, yet we carried on and ultimately won the race with the moon landing. And it was another reminder for U.S. citizens about the importance of perseverance, and it instilled the values of determination that we are familiar with today. And once we had won the race, the country was overcome with national pride. It was a huge victory for the country, and pride for our country is still definitely prominent today. And now the cultural effects, and how it was seen in pop culture. So before the space race, science fiction, it existed, but it definitely became more popular after the space race, and more movies and books and songs like Rocket Man and Man on the Moon were produced. And designs of cars also changed. For example, you can see in the picture of the Airstream, they were made to have like a futuristic look to them and almost resembled a rocket ship. And in homes, items like clocks and lamps had futuristic designs that looked like UFOs or similar to space gadgets. And even the toys that kids played with were influenced by the space race, and ray gun dart blasters and toy rockets were produced for the kids to play with.
The space race brought many challenges and questions to NASA. However, many of them were resolved through the advancement of technology. One major piece of equipment that was invented was a spacesuit. The spacesuits used in Apollo 11 were composed of 21 nested layers, which were strong enough to withstand a micrometeorite, but still offered flexibility to allow astronauts to move around space. The spacesuits were developed by a company called Playtex, a company that formerly used to make bras and girdles. Also, the spacesuits required fine craftsmanship and precision, so each was produced by hand, with each layer and stitch being sewn perfectly to ensure that the astronauts were protected against the harsh environment of the moon. Another piece of equipment that was developed was the tires that were implemented in the lunar rover. The tires were developed by Goodyear using a sophisticated design using woven wire mesh. The mesh was not only hand-cut and hand-woven, but it was also composed of zinc-coated piano wire, which provided durability and flexibility to withstand the lunar surface. Despite being extremely dense, each tire required 3,000 feet of piano wire. The lunar rover was maneuverable and able to endure the rugged lunar surface thanks to its innovative tires. The last example of technological advancements that were made during the space race were the parachutes used to slow the freefall of space capsules. Each parachute was crafted using 7,200 square feet of fabric. The specialized fabric was durable enough to withstand the weight of the capsule and capable of slowing it down from the speeds as high as 160 miles per hour. Each parachute was also assembled using 3.5 miles of thread and 2 million individual stitches, all done by sewing machines operated by hand. Only 3 people received certification from the Federal Aviation Administration to fold these specialized parachutes.
As previously mentioned before, the space race was a post-World War II competition between the United States and the Soviet Union to see who could achieve first in space supremacy. The conflict stemmed from the initial nuclear competition between the two and had ran from the mid-1950s till the climax of 1969, with the United States landing on the moon. With this competition, we saw some of the greatest technological advances in human history, and human beings traveling to places that previous generations thought were impossible. With these astonishing accomplishments came many costs and tensions that would have a lasting impact on relations between these two nations for years to come. The pros and cons of the conflict bring up the question of what are the ethics behind this? Is it worth it to invest so much time and effort into something that hardly impacts either country's population? It is our belief that despite the advances and seemingly unintended benefits it provided to the population as a whole in terms of development of education and engineering, that the space race overall was not ethical. There was no clear advantage gained from these expeditions, and the massive amounts of resources poured into these programs, other than being able to claim that they were the supreme leader of the world, had no real positives. The ends do not justify the means for the most part, and that is why we can say that overall the space race was not ethical given the other needs that both countries had during this time following the biggest and most devastating war in history, as well as it being rooted in trying to one-up a rival rather than accomplish any tangible good.
The space race resulted in a renewed spirit for Americans, in both exploration and invention. Schools received new funding for science programs and teachers' educations. We were given the Airstreams and the Jetsons. While the United States ultimately won the space race, the negatives that resulted for both countries means that the space race was an unethical pursuit regardless of any appreciable benefits gained.